All right, so this is Going There, Navigating Ethics and Power Dynamics of the Great Rite. I am Cassandra Zetelumen. I will be your presenter for this session. A little bit about me: I am a second-generation pagan and also a mother of one. I founded and then co-led a teaching coven from about 2001 to about 2019-ish. And our premise was really more about like helping people find their path. So we would teach seekers classes as a springboard, not as a recruitment tool. And in my free time, if I have any, I enjoy medieval reenactment, including armored combat. And if any of you are interested in medieval reenactment, including armored combat, you can definitely talk to me afterwards, because the first rule of Medieval Fight Club is tell everyone about Medieval Fight Club. So today we have a plan, and that plan is that we're going to first talk about terms and concepts so that we're all speaking the same language for our discussion later on. Then we are going to go over the results of a survey that I took, because I think we all as humans have the tendency to think that our opinions and ideas and premises are the normal ideas and opinions and premises, and probably roughly what we're doing is what a lot of people are doing. But we can't assume that. We have to say, like, okay, if we're going to talk about this, like, what are we really doing these days? And what is our experience and what do we think about that? So we'll go over the survey, and then we have a two-part structured discussion and some last little closing thoughts. During that discussion, there will be time for like sharing and personal comments and all kinds of stuff, but I want to say that if you have a question, like if there's a slide that requires clarification in that moment, feel free to ask that question. I want to also point out that this is being recorded, and so when you ask your question, if you feel like not identifying yourself or not introducing yourself, that's totally cool. Just be aware that it is being recorded and will be posted later. So, part one of the plan is definitions of practice. So we're here to talk about the Great Rite, and I want to have a moment where we talk about some differentiations and like parsing a couple of different things out. So first we have sex magic. Now, we're going to define for the purposes of this session that sex magic is going to be when you have an individual practitioner or practitioners in their own selves and their own identity. It's going to include actual physical intercourse, so it's going to involve sex because it's sex magic. And there's going to be some kind of magical intent behind that sex magic. And this is potentially in a ritual context, but not necessarily. So this could be in a magical circle, in a ceremony or a ritual, but it doesn't have to be. You can be practicing sex magic, say with a partner, without casting a circle, and just by having that raising of energy and magical intent. So this is what we're going to call sex magic. And then we have what we're going to call the Great Rite in true. And what we're talking about here is a deity is drawn down into the practitioner or practitioners. So instead of the practitioner in their own identity raising power as themselves in a circle and then performing the sex magic, it's that the deity is drawn down into the person. And then the idea is the deity is having the sex with the other practitioner, and that other practitioner may or may not be drawing down also. So you can have a god and goddess situation who then perform the Great Rite, or you can have a deity drawing down to imbue this point of the ritual, and we'll talk about that in a second, into somebody who is not doing a drawdown. It could go either way. And this is typically done in ritual setting. So when we're talking about the Great Rite in true, for the purposes of this session, we're talking about we're having a drawdown of the deity, and then performing the ritualized sex in a ritual setting, versus sex magic where that's not necessarily the case and it's just the own individual practitioner and their own identity. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Cool, so these are what we're gonna talk about when we get to our discussion, just to give language tools. Let's go ahead and move on to some other concepts, and these ones we're going to say are concepts of just ethics in general. I have a picture here of a doctor and a patient, because many of these concepts we trace back to healthcare initially. And we use them more ubiquitously in our culture now, but initially some of this started as like healthcare considerations. So the first one is consent. And you might not think about it, but when you go to the doctor, you sign a consent to treat. And so back in the day, you could be committed to, say, a mental institution by family. And you didn't necessarily, even if you had your own power of attorney, you didn't necessarily have to sign something. But these days you do. If you go to a doctor, you have to sign consent to treat, like, yes, you're allowed to treat me, right? Now, these days in our culture, consent does, when our conversations around consent do center around sex. And you have to get consent, and it has to be real consent, not pressured into it and all of these things. So consent with relation to sex is something that we're familiar with as a society these days, right? And then we have something called informed consent. Informed consent, we see this phrase more in healthcare, I'm not just going to waltz in and they're going to do some test and they're going to give me some pills and I have no idea what any of that was. They're going to tell me, doctors are told they have a responsibility to say, I'm going to do this test, it's to test you for strep throat. Okay, you do have strep throat. This is penicillin. You need to take this because it will kill the strep throat germs, right? So we have a duty to be informed about what's going on, why they're doing it, what maybe the risks or alternatives are, and we see that in healthcare. Informed consent in terms of sex would be that conversation you have about what is the birth control situation, what is the transmittable disease situation, right? So maybe you have someone, you have Susie Q. Exampleson and Joe Schmo Exampleton, and they're like, yes, we would like to have sex with one another. Now we have to have the informed consent of oh, but I'm not on birth control. And they're like, okay, well, do you still want to, now that you have been informed, is there still consent, right? So that would be informed consent when we're talking about sex. And all of this is important because of bodily autonomy. Now, we hear about bodily autonomy as a society these days because of abortion rights. But these concepts are all linked because you need to get consent because everyone owns their own body. I own my body. I'm the one who gets to say what happens. You own your body. You're the one who gets to say what happens. And it's all tied to the idea of bodily autonomy. We all own our own bodies, so we are the ones who get to say what happens to my body. So these are the concepts of ethics for when we move forward into discussion. We have some more concepts of ethics. And the one is a power differential. Now, depending on your background, you may have heard this term before or you may not have, but you've all experienced it. So a power differential is the term for when one person has more knowledge or influence than another person, especially if that power is over the other person, such as that person's teacher, that person's doctor, or that boss. So, for example, the senator of Arizona has more power and influence in our society than I do. There is a power differential there, but he doesn't have power over me exactly directly. I'm not one of his constituents. He's not making local policy for me. But for example, if I for my job am required to take continuing education and I have to pass that continuing education class or I lose my job, the teacher of that class has a lot of power over me. Not only do they have knowledge of and above and beyond, maybe they have to train me in, say, legal ordinances related to my job, so they have more knowledge than me, but they also are the one assigning my grade. They have direct power over me, and if I don't pass their class, I lose my job. So that would be an example of a power differential in life that we see. And your doctor has power over your body and whether or not you can get medicine, and your boss has power over what your wage is, like if they give you a good or a bad review. So these are examples of a power differential. And this is a concept, depending on what field you're in, you may have seen, but that's what it's called. We see this in our society where it's come forward in relation to the Me Too movement that started in 2017, particularly with the Harvey Weinstein stuff. That really opened the door to exposing how much workplace harassment was going under the radar because of power differentials. So it just became so prevalent of Me Too, Me Too, Me Too, of not only women who had experienced sexual assault, but also people who had been dealing with harassment in the workplace, who felt that there was no recourse for them to expose or oppose that harassment because of the power differential. They were concerned there was going to be retaliation that they would have no ability to hold their own against and still keep their job and their livelihood and support their families. So this is where we see an example of a power differential and it being exposed in how it was being abused, that power differential of workplace harassment and people even being sexually harassed and pressured and leveraged into doing things they didn't want to do, or there would be consequences like losing their job. So this is power differential and an example of abuse from the top. But there's another concept that goes along with power differential. It's kind of the flip side of the coin, and that is that sometimes admiration can feel a lot like infatuation. You can have someone who's got like the trope of crush on teacher, where you've got someone and they've got more knowledge than you and they're leading you in some way and you admire them in their job, and you get this little like infatuation or a crush based on this admiration of this person in a leadership position. And it's not like a genuine human connection. It's more of an infatuation from that admiration. You know, it's a circumstantial infatuation. And so because of these factors, the potential for abuse, the potential for realizing that that connection was actually circumstantial, and also for just the general messiness of navigating dual relationships in terms of conflicts of interest, where you've got someone who is your partner, but now also they have to give you a review for work. Like, how is that gonna, you know? The general best practice across disciplines where a power differential is recognized is to avoid romantic relations in that circumstance. So I work for a college, and let's just say that I'm a supervisor there. I'm not going to hire someone who's my romantic partner or my child to work directly under me. They're going to have to get a different supervisor or be hired by a different part of the college. Or even if they're in my area, we're going to assign a different supervisor to them because of that dual relationship, to avoid ethical conflicts of interest in that way. So common practice across disciplines where power differential is recognized is to avoid romantic relations, or in reality, it's to avoid dual relationships under that circumstance. So we have more concepts of ethics again here, and we have something that we are going to call investment bias. Now, this is not an exact clinical term. This is something I'm giving a label to this so that we have a ability to speak about it in our discussion groups. But this is where we have got, when we already have invested effort and or resources into an outcome, and so there we are then inclined to continue pursuing that outcome regardless of what we actually want or are comfortable with. So one example just in life would be, let's say I'm 3 out of 4 years through a math degree, and I realize maybe I actually wanted to be a physical therapist, but I'm so far along the path to being a mathematician. I've already invested money, I've invested time, I've taken all these classes. They don't overlap with physical therapy classes, you know, and it's so like, and there's that pressure to just finish the stinking math degree and go with it because I've already invested so much in it. So what we'll see, and we'll refer back to this later, but what we'll see, the equivalent in our pagan communities would be if we have started with a group and we're going along the degree path to that group, maybe we got to second degree in that group, and then we find that, oh, now that I've gotten second degree, some mysteries have opened, and there's going to be these expectations of like, oh, well, is this really what I want? But there's this investment of our time and our energy and our relationships. Do I really want to oppose that in this group? And I want to say again, the flip side of this coin, so in this investment bias, the sunk cost fallacy, is when we've got all this time and energy into it. But there's a flip side, kind of the other side of the coin, and that is what I'm going to call the deer in the headlights moment. And we've all experienced this, where in the moment, there's a moment of surprise of like, oh, this is what we're doing now, oh. And you don't have like the time, you just kind of go with the flow in the moment, and you're like, oh, okay. And you follow where you're led, and then you look back on it later, and you're like, you know, if I had been given time to think about it, I would have done something different. I wouldn't have done that if I had been given the opportunity to like integrate and like think about my life. Depending on your background as a human, you may see this and you may think disassociation, traumative experiences, fawning, and you would not be wrong, but this is an experience that people can have over and above beyond just a traumatic experience. This is something any human person, in the moment of surprise, of like, oh, this is what we're doing, can go along with something, which then they look back and like, well, crap. I wouldn't have done that if I'd been given a chance to really think about it. So these are some things. And all of this, what all of this leads us to is concept of ethics, last one I promise, meaningful consent. So meaningful consent would be consent that is truly centered in the individual's own wants and interests. It is not influenced by outside factors or perceived pressures. This is where the individual made their own decision. So meaningful consent. And this is something that you see again in like hookup culture in our wider society today, of when what they will say is getting a strong, full yes, like an enthusiastic yes for that sex. And what they're trying to get at there is, it wasn't like, okay, sure, or, oh, I wore you down, or I guess so. What they're saying is a strong, full yes. They're talking about meaningful consent that is informed, it is centered from the person's own intentions and desires, and it was a decision that they actually made for themselves, not because of a bias or a power differential or some kind of other pressure or outside factor. So these are some concept that we have that I want us to be able to speak to when we're having our discussion. And so let's just take a good, smooth breath and allow that to kind of percolate. Now let's go ahead and we're going to move on to the second part. And this is the survey. This survey was written by me, Cassandra Zetelumen, and it was distributed via Facebook. And it was open starting in November of 2023 when I first was confirmed that I was a presenter here. And I took my data earlier this week through March. It is still open, but my data, if yesterday someone went in and put their response in, I wouldn't have seen it, wouldn't be a part of this. I want to acknowledge some limitations of the survey in that I, as a working mom, did not really have the energy or time to distribute it extremely widely. I posted it to some pagan Facebook groups, I posted it to the Paganicon Facebook group, and I posted it on my wall a couple of times, so I put it out there, but it was only delivered via Facebook, so the only people who would have the opportunity to see this and take it would be people who were connected to those Facebook groups or me on Facebook. So obviously, in a perfect world, we'd have a lot more diversity in our community. But I did my best, and this is what I found. I was like, it's a sensitive topic, please get 25 responses, come on. I ended up having 43 responses. I felt like that was pretty good. So the first question that I had for people was, what is your understanding of the Great Rite? Because I wanted to make sure, if I'm going to have this survey, do we all kind of know what's up here? Of the responses, not everyone answered every question. Some of these questions were right in your own response, and so in those cases, I have categorized those responses myself. Nothing here is a verbatim response because I don't want to accidentally identify somebody. This one was people would write in their own answer, like a sentence or so. And then I went through and I read those answers and I put them into these categories to generalize them. Not every question was like that, but this question was. The first question was, please briefly describe your understanding of the physical Great Rite in true, not the symbolic version with the chalice and athame. And the responses we got, 11 people described what I would have called sex magic. So they're describing ritualized sex, they're describing raising energy and then releasing it like Kona Power style with the sexual act, and they're describing, but they didn't specifically mention a drawdown. So those 11 people, they described something that I would say, okay, that sounds like my understanding of sex magic. And then 10 people described something that I would consider okay, this sounds like what we're talking for our verbiage, Great Rite, where they describe a drawdown of a deity and then the sex stuff. So this is an important information to know because as we move forward through looking at the survey results, know that many of these responses are just as likely to be something that's like ritualized sex magic versus involving a drawdown specifically. So we need to, when we're looking at the data, just remember that the questions are framed as Great Rite, but the responses represent pretty much sex magic in general. So we did have 3 responses where they were kind of in between the two. They described something that I'm going to now call symbolic sex, where there was physical intercourse in a ritual setting, They didn't specifically mention a drawdown. They did specifically mention that it symbolized the union of deities, like symbolizing the union of masculine and feminine energies, right? So there is a sex magic application. It's symbolizing. Was there a drawdown? That was not specified. Then we have two people said symbolic but other. So they said it's a symbolic joining of masculine and feminine. But whether or not that was like Athame and Chalice style, it was unclear exactly if they were thinking actual sex, or if they're saying the Great Rite. To me, my understanding is it's any merging of masculine and feminine energy. So that was those responses. 3 people said they had little to no understanding. They just admitted, like, I have no idea. I'm just taking this survey. I'm a pagan person. I saw it. Here we are. Then 4 people, they had an answer that was something other than answering the question of their understanding of the Great Rite. So maybe they said they're a feeling about the Great Rite, or they said, I understand the Great Rite, or they said something like that, but they didn't define what the term Great Rite meant to them. So that would be this green one here. And then we had 10 people who did not respond to this question. They didn't write anything in. They did respond to other questions. They just didn't answer this one. So that was question number 1, was what is your understanding of the Great Rite? Question number 2, have you personally ever participated in any form of sex magic? So on this pie chart, red is no, blue is yes. We have 27.9% of people say no, they have never participated in sex magic, and 72.1% people say yes, they have participated in some form of sex magic at some point, right? And we have 43 responses to this, so everyone who took the survey did respond to this question. For as good as we can get for 43 responses, when there's like 1,200 people here, so these percentages might change. But I will say, as I saw respondents continue to submit answers to the survey, this percentage remained about the same. Where first it started off like a third, but then the more responses we got, this percentage of about like a little more than a quarter, less than a third of no's, and almost 3/4 or over 2/3 of yes. That stayed consistent throughout the various responses. And then moving forward, again, 43 responses, everybody responded to this question: have you ever participated in or been present for the Great Rite in a group or ritual setting, a group ritual setting, so a group, right? Now, red is still no, blue is still yes. 69.8% of people say no, I have never participated that in a group setting. And 30.2% said yes, I have seen that. And now this is, again, not 30% of rituals. This is 30% of respondents at some point in their life have participated or been present for the Great Rite in a group ritual setting. And remember, again, we're going to take this as any kind of group ritual sex, not necessarily with a drawdown. So that was what we found on that question. So the next slide, this is just speaking to that 30%, that 30.2% of people who have participated in a group setting. What type of ritual was it? What type of ritual have you participated that used that? So I'm going to draw your attention. We have 2 blue slices of pie. The light blue is just specifically Beltane. 11.8% of those people said Beltane specifically. Dark blue is a 17.6%, and that was a Sabbat, unspecified. So that might still be Beltane, we don't know, but we know that our 2 blue slices of pie together are just under 30%. It was like 29-point-something%, and that's Sabbats in general, especially Beltane. That's what we know. Then we move on to the orange. So we have the dark orange here at 17.6%. It was indicated was elevation to 3rd degree. So 17.6%, this group ritual setting was elevation to 3rd degree. Light orange was elevation unspecified. So, and I do want to say the people who responded saying elevation of some kind, they, as the respondents, were using elevation and initiation interchangeably. So people would say initiation to 3rd degree or whatever. Now if it had been me assuming, I use initiation only for 1st degree, that first initiation into a group, and elevation for 2nd and 3rd degree, but that's not what people were doing. People were using elevation and initiation seemingly interchangeably. Therefore, I should state that I have lumped together everyone in the elevation unspecified category, this light orange, 23.5%. Some of those people just said initiation, but we can't know if it was that initial initiation the way I would use the word initiation. Because it was, so I lumped them together. It seemed reasonable. So what this means is in our orange slices of pie, between elevations unspecified what type and elevations particularly third degree, we have about 40%. It's like 40 point whatever percent of times when we were seeing group ritualized sex practices of some type. It was some kind of elevation, especially third degree. That's what we know. And then we have the green slices are other stuff because these two were such large percentages. Dark green, we have 11.8% of people responded fertility. So there was a specific couple, and that, or like not all response, but I'm saying like there would be the target couple who were trying to conceive a baby. And so a group ritual was done for fertility where the couple then performed like group sex magic with the cone of power of the group to conceive a baby. It's not relevant, but it was indicated in responses that this was generally successful in the conception of a baby. Huh?
Huzzah.
Huzzah, yes, good job. 5.9% responded wedding, so some people getting jiggy with it officially in their wedding ceremonies. The format was not indicated. I imagine it to be a small group wedding. And then 11.8% of people responded a healing ritual of some kind. And before, like initially I was just like, a little bit hackles getting up. What are people doing having sex as part of healing? That could be problematic. I do want to say not all of the respondents in this category, but there was an indication from the category, a non-zero amount of indication, that this was actually more of a personal sex magic between the individual and deity without other humans involved. So they responded, and that showed up a couple of times that people were including sex magic with deity, where there are not just in a personal circle, no other humans involved, is in the mix as well. So this is where is that sex magic being used, that Great Rite being used? Big chunk, 40% elevations of some kind. Just under 30% sabbats, especially Beltane, and then we have a smattering of other fertility, a wedding apparently, and healing of some kind. And so that's where we're seeing this and being used from the sample group that I had. For both the last question and this one, people would, one time there could be individuals that had more than one thing. So somebody might say third degree and a sabbat, or healing and a third degree. And so the percentages are like not a one-to-one for the individual, they're for the type of ritual, if that makes sense. So this one is, again, check all that apply. This one had 40 responses, so most people of the 43 respondents did respond to this one. Check all that apply. Now this was one, I'm gonna read the actual full thing because they got cut off on the slide. Check all that apply. The first one, the idea is the Great Rite is a sacred practice that is typically given the respect it deserves. 9 respondents, or 22.5%, felt that, yes, this is an accurate statement. 22% felt it is a sacred practice, it is typically respected and performed respectfully given the stuff that it preserves. These percentages are going to line up to more than 100% because it's check multiple. The option number 2 is the Great Rite is a sacred practice, but it's often used inappropriately. 19 people, or 47.5%, responded with this. So half the people taking the survey responding to this question felt that it is a sacred practice, but it's being used inappropriately. That's almost half. The next one is, it can be a profound experience, but care and execution is required. 30 respondents, 75% of people thought it can be good, but you have to be really careful. And you can see most people who responded to the survey, out of 40 responses, 30 of them, or 75% of people, included this option. So the people are like having an awareness, the majority of, you have to be really careful when you include it. The next option would be, it's a profound experience, but extremely difficult to do well. 17 people, or 42%, said profound experience, but very difficult, easy to be problematic, difficult to do well. So that's again a little under half, 42.5%. 0 people selected it is inherently unethical. So of the responses that I got, people in our communities that found this survey and responded to it, they don't feel the Great Rite is inherently unethical. Just more like the application, apparently we have other concerns, not that it in itself is incorrect, which is honestly kind of makes sense because paganism is generally and has been very sex positive. And then the next one is, this is the only way that some rituals can be performed. 2 people, or 5%, included this, where they feel like it's just part of the tradition, it's the only way you can get the job done in these scenarios. So what that tells us is, in this sample size, there's a small but non-zero amount of people who that's their point of view. And then the last option was, it is honestly replaceable. Other options can get the job done. And we had 18 people, or about 45% of respondents, feel that it's replaceable. There are other options. You don't need the Great Rite. Now, I want to say 22 people didn't select that. That doesn't mean they're opposed to it. They didn't select the other one. We only had 2 people that say it's the only way you can get certain things done in certain rituals, and then we have some people it's honestly replaceable. So we have 2 people and 18 people of the 40, 5%, 45%. So that's what we found in that one.
That second to last one gives me pause.
Yeah.
It makes me deeply uncomfortable.
Right? Yeah. So it's interesting because, the data doesn't lie, and the purpose of this data is to find out, what are we doing? Like, what are our beliefs and practices? And it's so good to do this research and to realize, because again, the purpose of the survey is, we always, like as humans, we want to think that obviously the things I think are the normal, correct things. But in reality, we gotta okay, what are we doing? What do we think? So it's a small, but it's a non-zero amount of people who are like, yeah, that is the only way to do certain things. So this is what we found from our responses.
But even again, if you look at the bottom percentage, the bottom question, is it honestly replaceable in, I don't remember what the whole thing said.
Honestly replaceable in any ritual. There are other options that can get the job done.
Right, but only 45%. 18 people said yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are some
people.
people.
So that means that, there's still a large percentage of people who either didn't answer. No, 40 people responded.
40 people responded, yeah, what that tells us is just that we don't know exactly where they are between those 2 options on that spectrum. They may be somewhere in the middle. They may have decided, I don't know. They may not know themselves. They haven't thought about it before, and so they decided just not to select either one. We don't know. We only know the data that we can see, and that's the thing, is you always have to be really careful about making assumptions about the data you can't see, because sometimes it's like, oh, that's very indicative, and sometimes it's like, okay, well, we just don't know, and they might not even know themselves. They may have chosen not to answer one of those 2 questions because they thought, I need to think about that more, and so they just moved on. We don't know. All right, so we have one question. The next slide is slightly, it's related. It's not specifically about ritualized sex magic. I included it just because it's kind of on the same topic, kind of. And this is, what is your opinion on coven teachers and leaders entering into sexual and romantic relationships with their students? And so in this slide, the red are the people who indicated always unethical. That's 37.2%. People said always unethical for teachers to enter into sexual or romantic relationships with their students. The orange it's almost always unethical, except in specific circumstances. Now, I want to say in this was a select one questionnaire, but there was the opportunity for people to write in their own response in other at the bottom. And for this always unethical section, there were some people who wrote in their own responses who said, I'm pretty sure it's unethical, but I admit that there may be circumstances I haven't thought of. And so I admit there may be circumstances I haven't thought of, but I think always unethical. Those types of responses in the write-ins I included in almost always unethical, except under certain circumstances, because they were kind of allowing that there may be a circumstance where it wouldn't be. So those people are also represented in the orange, 34.9%. There was a care should be taken option of this has a strong chance of going poorly. So it's like not inherently unethical, but you have to be really careful. And that was the yellow here. 14% of people said it's not inherently unethical, but you just need to be really careful because there's a strong possibility for things to be problematic. And then the green is 4.7% of people is under some circumstances, this could be a bad idea, but if they are both consenting adults, there shouldn't be a problem. You're an adult, I'm an adult, we're in the community, there shouldn't be a problem. That was 4.7% of responses chose that one. And then there was 7% of the people with write-in responses who specifically said it's unethical only while the power differential persists, basically. Like, while they are the student, then it is unethical, but once the class ends, then now we're both members. Or like, it's unethical while one is, like, if you've got a second degree with a new initiate, then that's problematic, but once the person is more like there's no longer a power differential, they're both integrated members of the group, maybe they're both second degrees, now it's not unethical anymore. And so 7% of people wanted to particularly point that out, that yes, it is unethical while the student-teacher relationship persists, but then once that equalizes, they're no longer thinking like, okay, now it's okay. And then we did have 2.3 responses of other, where somebody chose to write something in that was kind of like an opinion, but didn't really speak to the ethics of the situation. So they had like a complaint about student teacher, or they had an opinion about something, but it didn't speak to actually answering the question in terms of their opinions of like the ethics or whatnot of it. All right, so that was question number 6. Question number 7, there was a question at the end. This was the last question in the survey, and it's, do you have any thoughts that you want to share? Is there anything else on the topic that you want to write in that you want to share? And again, for the sake of anonymity, I then went through the responses. Not everybody had something else they wanted to share, but I went through and I categorized the responses into different types of thoughts and categories so as to avoid a personal story, even though they didn't identify themselves or their group, a personal story accidentally giving away something that somebody else would like, oh, I think that was Susie that did that one, So I wanted to preserve anonymity. So what we had in the people who were writing things in, amid their responses, 2 people wanted to go out and say that the Great Rite should only be performed if all present, and if all the people present are in the correct mindset and very clear on the intention. So what they're saying here is they responded in some way, they included in their response that if you're planning to do a ritual that involves the Great Rite, and you show up that day and you've got people who are just like the vibe is off, or you realize there's not good communication, not everyone is clear on the intent, you don't do it that day. So in the moment, you only do it if everyone there, the participants as well as the people who are just there, part of the group, you only do it if everyone's in the correct mindset and everyone's clear on the intentions. So then amid all the responses, 3 people responded with positive vibes only. They really wanted to get in there that the Great Rite is beautiful, it is powerful, it can be very deep, meaningful practice. They had no caveats, they had nothing else they wanted to say, they just wanted to represent what a gorgeous, beautiful, powerful practice the Great Rite can be. And that was like, in whatever words they used, that was what the response was. Then we had 6 people of the people who responded included in their write-in response that this is a positive thing, it is a beautiful, gorgeous, powerful thing, but it should never be a requirement / an alternative must always be available. So of the people who wrote in, 6 people particularly included in some way an alternative must be available. It should never be required. Then we have blue, we have 4 people included in their response that it should only be performed between committed partners and in private. And this took a variety of turns in what people were saying in these 4 different responses of sometimes it was combined with there should be an alternative. So perhaps the scenario is you have a ritual, and that is a ritual which could, say Beltane, say an elevation, whatever it is, could include the Great Rite. But you only actually include the Great Rite if you've got 2 committed partners who are already in an established relationship, and they're going to go off somewhere private to do that. Like maybe it's still in a large circle, but in a private place, or they're going to maybe do the ritual and then go home and complete the energy at home. So there were 4 respondents who said the Great Rite should only be performed between people who are already committed partners, and that the actual act should be private, in a private setting. There was one response particularly stating that not that it is unethical to include the Great Rite, but it is unethical for it to be kept a secret if it is required. So this response was centering around the idea that maybe these traditions do require the Great Rite. Maybe they do. Maybe there aren't alternatives in that tradition. But if that's the case, then you have to be upfront about it. It should not be oath-bound that it is a requirement. It can the details can be oath-bound. Oath-bound ceremonies have a lot of functions to preserve the magic to people who haven't gone through them, and etc. But the fact that if it's required, the fact that it's required should not be oath-bound. That needs to be upfront, right? We also had one response of pre-existing romantic relationships should avoid starting a student-teacher relationship. So this was the thing that person wanted to throw in there. It's not just if you have a student, don't date that student. It's also if you have a partner, set up a different teacher, right? So let's just say that let's say I'm the leader of a teaching coven and my partner is interested in taking Seekers classes. We're going to find a different teacher in this scenario to teach those Seeker classes other than me, so that my partner doesn't have me for a teacher. So they were kind of throwing in there that flip side. And then we have 3 people specifically in their responses voiced concerns about manipulation with that power differential type. Like maybe they didn't use the term power differential, but they basically were stating with that power differential dynamic, the opportunity for manipulation is just so intrinsic and so high and difficult to manage. So there were 3 people who particularly called out concerns about manipulation. 3 people voiced that they felt the GLBT plus community was excluded. Like the thing that they wanted to put in there was that the GLBTQIA Two-Spirit plus community was excluded from the Great Rite because of the heavy focus on masculine-feminine. And I do want to say, throughout the survey, you have a couple of places where people are writing in answers, and it wasn't in other data sets, it wasn't relevant in those data sets, but I will bring it up here, that when talking about practices and what ritual and everything, there were some responses that said basically in their tradition any gender can do the Great Rite, and I suspect they're probably talking, I don't know, actually they didn't say, so we don't know if we're talking Great Rite sex magic, ritualized sex magic between any gender, whatever works for you and your partner, whatever, or Great Rite drawdown. Right, so throughout the survey we had people writing in that specifically in their tradition any gender combination, as long as the participants are okay with it, any gender combination is acceptable. And throughout the survey, we also had people saying, well, this question doesn't really speak to GLBT, but there's exclusionary factors there. So there are definitely some different perspectives from the sample group coming in on how this relates to the GLBT plus community. And then we had one respondent who's opposed to it in general. Now, I want to point out, on the previous slide, we had 40 respondents. Had the opportunity to say that the Great Rite is inherently unethical, and they didn't respond there. Nobody said it was inherently unethical, but one person said they're opposed to its use. So what they're saying is, in our group practices, the way it was worded, in our group practices, we need to move on. This person is of the opinion, so a small but non-zero amount of respondents said, it's not that it's unethical, it's that we need to move on and just not include it. I mean, they're opposed to it being included in group practice. So, maybe what you do with your partner is whatever you do, but in group practice, this should not be included. That was the opinion of that person. Okay. So that was the survey. So now, okay, this is from the ability of our, from the extent of our ability to get data. That is what we are doing and what people are feeling about it at the moment. So now we're going to go on to discussions. We have just enough people, I think, to have 2 groups today. So organize yourselves. So you can go ahead and stand up, look around, organize yourself into group, and then sit back down once you have your group so that everybody has a chance to like find a group and be in it. All right, so now we're in our groups. Basically, we have acquired groups. Good work. So now we're going to move into the structured discussion portion in our small groups. And the first one is the ability to have initial thoughts, because you've been sitting here listening to me talk for almost an hour, having whatever internal thoughts you're having. So I'm going to give you 3.5 minutes to just have initial thoughts and try to give everybody the opportunity to have words of your first impressions and takeaways. Maybe you have personal feelings, maybe you have things that surprised you. And I'm going to give you 4 minutes to just have initial thoughts as individuals in your small group. Okay, so we're going to wrap up the first chunk here. We're going to move on. Our next chunk of small group topics are going to be focused on people. Obviously, there are endless scenarios you could what if about like the Great Rite, like what if a child is conceived, what if this, what if that. But we're going to focus the small group topics on groups of people, not on scenarios. So our next small group focus topic is, what are the implications of ritualized sex for the GLBTQIA community members? And so we're gonna do 3-minute topics to be respectful of our time. So to just think about, because this did come up through the survey, I didn't have a question specifically about it, but it came up on its own of what are the implications of ritualized sex magic for the GLBTQIA plus community. Really quick definitions moment. G, gay, L, lesbian, B, bisexual, T, trans, Q can be queer or questioning, I is intersexed. That would be the medical group of people we would previously have called hermaphrodites, which we no longer use that term. The proper term now is intersexed. A can mean aromantic or asexual. These are people who do not have sexual attraction at all. It's not part of their makeup. And plus is, of course, we've got two-spirit and other types of communities. So I'm going to go ahead and start a 3-minute timer for your small groups for this topic. All right, that's 3 minutes. Our next slide is going to be, what are the implications of ritualized sex magic for people carrying transmittable diseases? A lot of times, your own sexual history and whether or not you've been affected by a transmittable disease is nobody else's business. And then maybe all of a sudden you turn up, maybe it's a Beltane, maybe it's, maybe you are finding out about this, the terms of your 3rd degree initiations. Now all of a sudden, it's relevant, So what are the implications of ritualized sex magic for people carrying transmittable diseases who are still our dedicated students? They're still part of our community having these spiritual experiences with us. All right, so we've got 3 minutes. Go ahead. All right, that's our 3 minutes. 3 minutes for that topic. Very good. All right, so our next group focus topic, what are the implications of ritualized sex magic for the high priest, high priestesses? This one comes up because in the write-in responses, in the definitions, there were many times when the definition itself was that specifically the high priest or high priestess would do the drawdown and have the sex with the initiate or the student, right? The elevating party. So it is now specifically in this group, the high priest, high priestess's job to be having the sex with everybody who wants to get a degree from that group. So 3 minutes, what's the, in that situation, or maybe like the group wants to do a Beltane with the Great Rite. What are the implications for the high priest and the high priestess who now are in the role where it's their job to have the sex? So we've got 3 minutes. Go ahead. Okay, that's time for that one. All right, our next group focus topic, what's the implications for those with a history of assault and abuse? Okay, so let's wrap up this focus question. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to discussion part 2. So your last piece of homework in your focus groups is to use like this 3-minute chunk of time to decide if there's one primary comment, topic, question, something you felt wasn't really touched on, something you want to hear more about as a group, that you want to bring back, because this part 2 is going to be back in the large group. And so as a small focus group, was there something that really stuck out to you that you want to, your group is like, yeah, let's talk about this topic, or let's answer this question, and we're going to bring those back to the large group. So I'll give you 3 minutes to determine if you have a group question or group topic that we want to speak more to. Okay, that's that 3-minute mark. So let's go ahead and come back to the large group. So obviously, we got into some good discussion. Was there, kind of going around the room, was there that moment of like that one key thing, like, yeah, this is the topic we want to speak to or hear more about or whatever?
Predatory behavior.
And predatory behavior.
We
Yeah.
discussed also, what about the oath-bound, if we cannot have discussions
Yes.
about this, how can we make decisions and good boundaries and have good rights? So there's an oath-bound issue regarding the Great Rite.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so good. For the purposes of the recording, so that question started off, that topic started off history of assault and abuse type stuff, but that also plays into the experiences of LGBTQIA plus community, the Black community, and these other types of abuses, and also talking about how can we have good informed decisions, how can we have good informed conversations when we have oath-bound material. So what I would say too, there's this concept in equity, if you get into equity work, where a piece of accessibility, even when designed for one specific group, positively impacts the larger group. So if you have a curb cut and it's for wheelchairs, that curb cut also positively impacts elderly people in a walker, it positively impacts anyone riding a bicycle, it positively impacts mothers with strollers. So the curb cut was ADA required for wheelchairs, but it positively impacts multiple groups. So when we're talking about solution-oriented thinking around these topics and being ethical in our practices, when a lot of what you're talking about, and that came back around to predatory behavior, how can we arm ourselves, how can we be ethical, the whole point of this session was if there is a practice we're doing, we have the responsibility to discuss it, to think about it ahead of time, so that we're going in as doing our good work in our own personal selves of those ethical practices. And anything that we do, whether it's geared towards like having alternatives because of a history of abuse, it's also going to benefit multiple groups, having alternatives or whatever, or choices or information available because of LGBTQ whatever, right? So that is absolutely a really good thing. In terms of oath-bound material, the only thing I can really put out there to that is because I understand why groups have oath-bound material. It's not because they're just being assholes. It's because there's something where there's a powerful, deep experience that if you start talking about it to just anybody, it robs people coming along down the line of having that powerful, authentic experience themselves, not just sex magic, but like any oath-bound thing. And also, in Wicca in particular, there's the idea of like to know, will, to dare, and to be silent, because holding that power in yourself without, having it all over the place. So we have this oath-bound idea. Now, I would put forward, and this is the premise of this session, I would put forward, we should, and we not only we can, but we should talk about the Great Rite, talk about sex magic, talk about these things. And that doesn't mean we have to specifically speak to the individual experiences that we have in the oath-bound ceremonies. So the Great Rite is a practice, and I can talk about the elements of that practice without saying anything about any ritual I did or did not participate in. Specifically, just like, so I'm a massage therapist, I can tell you I had, Susie Q client had this experience in my session. I had this who was a swimmer, and there was this repetitive motion athletic overuse. And I can talk about repetitive motion athletic overuse. I can talk about the movement that I see in swimmers who are my clients, but I'm not giving away the identity of that client. I can talk about the situation, I can talk about the topic, and we should talk about the topics of our practices. And that doesn't mean that I have to violate oath-bound things. That would be, we only have very few minutes left in this session. I want to go over here. Did you guys have a topic in your focus group?
I think mostly what we came down to was the ethics behind everything all comes down to consent.
Yeah.
No matter what you're doing in that ritual, whether it's a Great Rite 2 or symbolic or whatever, you have talked about it beforehand and you have that consent with the members of the group and even the deities if you're drawing down.
Yeah, good. That is such a good segue. And because we are getting on time, I'm going to move on to closing thoughts. Moving forward, as we go back into our communities and we discuss the Great Rite and sex magic in our communities, in our circles, in large spaces and in small private spaces, there are some takeaways that I, as a humble presenter, would put forward. And so one of those is bodily autonomy, because it all comes down to who owns that body. One thing that didn't happen to come up so much in the large group, but that I have heard elsewhere, is this idea about the Great Rite that because you are drawing down the deity, it's the deity having the sex. And therefore, in the written-in responses, we had some people give examples of their personal experience where they did feel pressured, whether that was pressured to take nudes, pressured in a group setting, where they said like, hey, this is the scenario, this was the ritual, and they expressed that they had felt pressured. And one of the scenarios that comes up that I hear around is, you shouldn't have a problem with this because it's not you having the sex, it's the God having the sex. And what I would say is, you have to, as we have these conversations and we go out to our broader community, you have to remember bodily autonomy. It doesn't matter if it's the God having the sex, it's the person's body. The person is the one who owns their body. The person is the one who gets to say what they do, what they are or are not comfortable with. And that also applies to, we do not own our students' bodies. We cannot answer for them as to what they should or should not be comfortable with. We cannot say, well, you joined my tradition, this is what my tradition entails, so you don't have that bodily autonomy anymore, you just have to go along with this tradition. You wrote that off when you joined the group. That's not okay. That's not an ethical practice, and I feel comfortable saying that, even though we have many varied traditions, I feel comfortable saying this. And the other one is, it's always the individual who gets to say what their body will or won't be doing, even if a God is drawn down. I already said that part. So these are some of my takeaways. Also, just please, one good takeaway, meaningful consent is free of power differentials, is free of disassociation and surprise, is free of that investment bias, the sunk cost fallacy we talked about, and is free from pressures from leaders and or from peers. If you're gonna get meaningful, real true meaningful consent, you have to think about these factors that can affect people's decision making in your small intimate groups. Otherwise, sometimes you can take advantage of a bias without really realizing you did it. So you have to think about it on purpose and make sure that you are behaving in an ethical way. And I would say one really valuable piece of paganism is the idea that we are all our own clergy to a certain extent. We all have our personal relationship with divinity. And therefore, even if you're in a group setting, even if you have a high priest or high priestess, you always have the power for that autonomy. You always have a power of dissent and to bring something to discussion. One really good piece of advice I got in my life, if you're ever in any situation, romantic relationship, business situation, any situation, pay attention to what happens when you dissent. How is it handled if you disagree? And this is going to tell you valuable information about the group that you're in that moment. Thank you for your time. We are now out of time. The audio for this presentation and a copy of the PowerPoint will be available at the facebook.com/magicalgrowth, complimentary picture of cock. Here. And so if you're interested in having that website for this presentation, or the Magical Growth Series is its own section of classes, you can find that. There's handouts, there's flyers there that are here. Thank you so much.